Good afternoon and welcome to the March Dean's Research Seminar, Building Sustainable Partnerships to Deliver Animal Health Programs in Regional and Remote Indigenous Communities. My name is Professor Jo Devlin and I'm Associate Dean Research. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional land I'm on land of the Wurundjeri people. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners that you are on, acknowledge that Indigenous Australians have been custodians of the lands and waterways of Australia for thousands of years. I pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. Our speaker today, Professor Elizabeth Tudor, graduated with a Bachelor of Veterinary Science Honours at the University of Melbourne and then completed her PhD at the Monash Medical School. After 10 years in small animal practice, she returned to Melbourne University as a tutor in 1998 and joined the veterinary school in 2008. She's held the position of Associate Dean Curriculum from 2008 to 2018. She's on the committee at the board of animal management in rural or Indigenous communities. Liz has been awarded 2 faculty awards for teaching and learning, also the AVA National Award for Excellence in Teaching, a University Knowledge Transfer Award, and a University Award for Outstanding Leadership in Teaching. In 2020, Liz was awarded the Member of the Order of Australia for significant service to veterinary science, tertiary education and animal welfare. In 2005, Professor Tudor established the West Arnhem Land Dog Health Program to provide annual veterinary services to remote Northern Territory Indigenous communities. Liz is also chairperson and co-founder with husband Rick of the Melbourne Indigenous Transition School. So we are very much looking forward to her seminar today. Please let's welcome Professor Elizabeth Tudor.
Many thanks, Jo, and for that rather too generous welcome. So, like Jo, I would like also to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which each of us is today. For me, the Venereal people of the Mornington Peninsula. I'd like to also acknowledge the Canine people of the wonderful country I was on over the weekend in Gippsland. So, as Jo has said, I'm going to speak to you today about dog health programs in that we've established in regional and remote Indigenous communities. And I'm just thinking, should I try and stop my screen, stop the video? There we go. As I do so, though, I guess I wonder, I feel a bit overawed in that I'm presenting at a Dean's Research Seminar because, as most of you will probably know, I'm actually a teaching specialist. And so I come to today's talk probably feeling somewhat like the fox here amongst the foxhounds, somewhat of an imposter in a Dean's Research series. As a teaching specialist, I guess, we're charged with teaching, obviously, but to do it with considerable scholarly activity, creation, innovation, collaboration and dissemination are all part of what we do as teaching specialists. But I've chosen not to talk about that today, but instead to talk about, I guess, one of the other strands of the triple helix of the University of Melbourne, which is engagement, and the engagement that we have embarked upon through our work as my work as a veterinarian. But as I do so, I want to go back to the very beginning. I want to go back to a time many millennia ago when people first walked this wonderful continent that we call home. The people particularly of the Northern Territory, and I want to tell you a little bit about Durukjang, or dog dreaming, because back in the beginning of time when people first walked this earth, there were 2 very special dogs, and their names were Omwal and Ajmalal. And for the people of West Arnhem Land, these dogs came from somewhere in the west, somewhere over near perhaps present-day Darwin, and they moved across the country from west to east. They moved, they stopped, they slept, they dug holes where they slept, and those holes filled with water. And those water holes became the water holes that sustained the people of this wonderful country. These 2 dogs, Omwal and Ajmalal, made their way all the way to the present settlement of Gunbalanya in West Arnhem Land. They'd walked across the black soil plains and they reached the stony escarpment of Arnhem Land. And Arjamalal, the boy dog, climbed up the escarpment and looked back over the black soil plains. Omwal had lingered behind, and when he turned around to look, he saw that Omwal had broken her leg. And in fact, she'd broken her leg and died where she broke her leg and was turned to stone. And she remains there in her stone form, her spirit having been taken up into the stone of the land, and she stays there still on her 3 legs. Arjamalal, for his part, was so overcome by grief when he lost his partner that he began to cry, and he formed the waterfall, which now cascades off the escarpment and down onto the black soil plains, and his spirit resides in the rocky face of the escarpment. These stories are integral to the people of the spiritual beliefs of the people of West Arnhem Land, and they paint a picture of a relationship with dogs which is much deeper than perhaps the relationship we enjoy with our own dogs, a relationship in which it was actually the dogs who created the water, which of course sustains all life. And to me, it's, I guess, a really poignant acknowledgement of the centrality of dog ownership for people in this part of the world. And we remember this whenever we look at the Billabong in Gumbalanya, which is now called Arjamalal Billabong. I now move on through many millennia and come to invader observations. And I think there's a lot that we can learn about dog-human relationships for Indigenous people through some of the first contact views that we have access to. George French Angus was an Englishman. He came to Australia in 1836. He came to the small settlement of Adelaide in South Australia, which had been colonised in 1828. So he was there only 8 years after first contact of Aboriginal people, the inhabitants of that land, with white people. He was an illustrator, he was a naturalist, and of course this is before the time of photography. So these illustrators were faithfully reproducing what they saw, and we can, I think, learn a lot from their images. Here we see some incredibly athletic and fit individuals. For me as a veterinarian, for me as someone who's passionate about the human-animal bond, I look particularly at the pose here of the woman with her dog. And you can see, I think we can read much into it in terms of the relationship that this person clearly has with their dog. Another image, this one, he spent 6 months, only 6 months in South Australia, and he travelled with the explorer Ernest Giles down to the mouth of the Murray and to the Coorong. And here again, he's captured the dwellings of the local people there. And again, the dog. I don't think he probably had perhaps the same passion for the dog-human bond that I do, but he captured it because he was capturing what he saw, and this is what he saw. And some more illustrations. This is just really more of the same. You can again see another dwelling, a family group together, the fire alight, people keeping warm around the fire, and just as we would with our own pets, I guess, here's the dog. And again, a woman clearly demonstrating the affection between dog and owner. We now move on to New South Wales, and Augustus Earle was actually a portrait painter who again came to Australia for only a short period of time. He did a lot of painting for wealthy colonisers and painted their portraits and so on, but he also captured some images of the time. And this one, to me, is so poignant and sad. We're now looking at a time which is 38 years after the first settlement in Sydney. And the title itself says it all, doesn't it? A native family of New South Wales sitting down on an English settler's farm. So in this man's lifetime, it's gone from being his own land to the claim that he's now sitting on an English settler's farm. Obviously, we could draw a lot from the pose of these individuals, the apparent desolation perhaps of them, but what we can also I guess, gain from this picture is the relationship, the very easy and natural relationship between the people and their dogs. Moving on then to Victoria, and a man called Robert Bruff Smith, who actually arrived in Australia in 1852, the same year, in fact, that my great-grandparents arrived in the colony of Victoria. And he, in fact, became, after some period of time, the government protector of Aboriginal people. He also became passionate about what he described himself as capturing the last vestiges of Indigenous civilizations before they were lost. So there was a recognition even back then of the decimation of Aboriginal life and culture. But he also made comment about the dogs. Native dogs are found in every encampment. They're in all conditions, some mature and strong, some in the stage of puppyhood. Not less than 20, maybe 40 may be seen at any time when a number of natives camp for the night. But then, and some other observations, telling us, I guess, about how Aboriginal people used their dogs in their working life. They took pups from the wild dog, brought them up and trained them to hunt. They're not only affectionate and faithful companions, but they're of the greatest use. They assist in finding opossum snakes, etc. And this rather quaint Victorian-style expression, I suppose, they are, however, not generally well fed. The black eats the meat, the dog gets the bones. A great many ribs, some belonging to the dead and some of the living, may be seen whenever a black's camp is approached. But he goes on and repeatedly describes the affectionate care that Aboriginal people had for their dog. It's not just gentle treatment and kind words. Sometimes the women even nurse and suckle the pups and so bring them up. I mentioned that, and then I crossed to a photo that I took just 12 months ago in Gulawinku on Elcho Island in the Northern Territory. There was an awards assembly happening at the school, an outdoor awards assembly, and I just captured again this image, this enduring image of this gentle and continuing bond of people with their dogs. So this journey for me began a long time ago when I was a vet student. And I had the opportunity as part of my EMS training to go to Gumbalanya, which was then known as Owen Pelly, which was the whitefellow name that had been given to the mission station, which is where Gumbalanya is, which of course is the dreaming country for Omwal and Arjumalal. I went as a vet student. There was a working cattle station there, and I guess just gained wonderful experience seeing the work of the cattle station and also the work that the missionaries were doing there. This couple and their child were at the time, he was the farm manager working in Gumbalanya, and in addition to that, there were, I suppose, probably 400 or so people living there. Some of them still, I guess, kept collecting a lot of bush tucker from the billabong. There was a busy clinic with obviously a huge burden of disease. Diseases I had no idea still existed in Australia. For example, leprosy, which in those days was, in the late 70s, was still quite a prevalent disease in Indigenous Australia. So that was the 1970s, and I was very touched by the time that I had there, very moved by the time that I had there, but had no reason, I guess, to return. But then in the early 2000s, we happened to meet someone who invited us to visit Gumbalanya, and so we did. And in the course of our visit, we met this little girl, Rona, who required open heart surgery, came to Melbourne, and Rona became a part of our lives and remained so for the following 18 or nearly 20 years. So because of the time, I guess, that Rona spent with us, she spent a lot of time with us in Melbourne. She had repeated surgeries and a lot of convalescence and all sorts of complications, which meant that she became a part of our family and spent a lot of time with us. And in fact, some of you will have met Rona because she quite frequently popped into my office. If we were going for a visit to the Children's Hospital, we'd then possibly detour on the way home via my office. So some of you will no doubt have met her and remembered her. Rona's country was the Stone Country in central Arnhem Land, this extraordinary, remote and wonderful country where she lived in a very small place called Mulgawar. And so Rona invited us to come back to her country. She'd spent a lot of time on our country, and she and her auntie, who was her carer, invited us to return with her to the Stone Country, which is what we did in 2004. And when we went to this country, we met Josie, pictured here, and her many dogs. This little outstation was inhabited by only a dozen people, but 48 dogs. There was an airstrip. We landed at the airstrip, but CASA were about to close the airstrip because the dogs were a menace on the airstrip. In fact, not long before we went there, the local council had sent out a couple of fellas from Goombalanya, in their words, to fix up the dog problem in Mulgawar. They arrived. Josie was not home. She was out in the bush somewhere. The dogs were there. They saw these two white fellas or Ballander arrive, and they all scattered except for one dog. This dog was a dog that was on 3 legs. It was hopping along on 3 legs. So they got out their rifles and finished off the dog and went home pleased with themselves that at least they'd put this one dog out of its misery, quote unquote. Josie came home to find her deceased dog. Her dog's name was Omwal, named after the spirit dog. It was not a dog. The dog had been on 3 legs since birth. It had been born with a deformity of one of its legs. There was not a more special dog in the community that they could have chosen to shot, but that one, which just goes again to demonstrate the desecration of belief and the misunderstanding, the lack of cultural understanding that has, I guess, impeded development in these parts of the world for so long. So we decided that we would help Josie to de-sex her dogs so that she had a sustainable population of dogs rather than the number of dogs that just resulted from indiscriminate breeding. This is just a bit of a diversion here. This is a hot and tough part of the world, but Josie single-handedly had built this extraordinary contraption here with beds up off the ground for all of her dogs, indicating again the relationship that people have with their dogs. So that was, I guess, our introduction to dog-human interaction in remote communities. I want to just talk a little bit now about the roles that dogs occupy in contemporary Indigenous Australia, bearing in mind that all of this is based on the observations that we have from those times of an invasion and first colonisation, obviously our own observations now, but also our understanding of the underpinning spiritual beliefs of people. And I won't go over again those. I think you can understand that these spiritual beliefs are very deeply held, and they certainly are important in the relationships that people have with their dogs. Kinship relationships is also important. Aboriginal people, particularly in Northern Australia, have a very complex and sophisticated system of kinship relationship. Everyone is related to somebody else. And in many situations, people actually extend that kinship relationship to their dogs. And so the little boy pictured here with his dog in the pusher, that little dog was actually his sister. It was his sister, and he waited many hours. We'd spayed the dog and de-sexed the dog, and he'd waited at the gate, and we'd seen him there time after time waiting with his pusher for his dog to be brought home. And when she came home, he insisted that that we put her in the pusher, and he was going to push her up to the house. Needless to say, the dog was out of the pusher barely before I got into the pusher. But important relationships, and that becomes important too because it was actually that little boy's decision that he wanted his dog de-sexed. It was not a decision for his mother or his dad or his auntie to make. It was his decision because he was in the close relationship with the dog. Dogs obviously have a continuing role in hunting, just as they do for many non-Indigenous Australians. Also, they're used as protection from night prowlers. Greta here pictured with her puppy, had acquired this puppy because she wanted somebody to keep her safe, and so that she was alerted to people prowling in her garden at night. Also, dogs hear things that we don't hear, so they're able to hear spirits moving around, potentially bad spirits moving around. Dogs bark, they can chase those spirits away. And just as in any society, the human-animal bond, and particularly the canine-human bond, is based on one of friendship. Having said all that, though, there are issues in dog-people interactions in Indigenous communities. And you can see here, this is actually in a West Daly community called Nunmarriunga, where we also work. And you can see just how skinny and underfed the dogs are, most probably because the family who has these dogs simply doesn't have the means to support all the dogs that are actually breeding. There's a number of issues. Sheer numbers, too many dogs. Dog noise, barking and fighting at night certainly disturbs people's sleep. I've certainly had nights in communities where one is kept awake just by the constant barking of dogs. If dogs are entire, they're going to be out looking for bitches in season. There's more activity, I guess, and lots of noise. Dog litter, swirling with faeces, spilling of rubbish, as you can see from this rubbish bin here that's been tipped over by the dog and then scavenging in the bins. Dog bites, very significant. In non-Indigenous Australia, people who are bitten by dogs are generally bitten by their own dog. It's generally a family dog that has its tail pulled or is in some way aggravated and bites someone that it knows. In Indigenous communities, dog bites tend to happen when strangers are walking through locations where the dog lives, and dog bites are quite a significant cause of morbidity in Indigenous communities. And then dog disease, and we'll talk more about that in a moment, and also cruelty to dogs. We come back to that expression, a great many ribs, some belonging to the dead and some to the living, and you can see here just how skinny some of these dogs are, and these are from a number of different communities. But when the wet season comes, when there's issues with food security for people, there are going to be even greater issues with food security for dogs. I mentioned cats just here with this one slide, and some of you will know that Jemima Emery-Gale is through her research work, is looking at ways of controlling feral cats in Australia. These are only 8 of 48 cats that we found residing in one house in an island community that we visited. So cats are becoming an increasingly important problem as well. So why do we worry about dog health when we've got obviously all sorts of issues with human health? Why in communities such as these, why are we worried about dog health? Well, animal welfare obviously matters. As veterinarians, animal welfare matters very much to us. And importantly, dog well-being actually matters to their owners. They don't want to have skinny dogs. They don't want to have diseased dogs. It's only for the lack of access to veterinary care that they end up with dogs that are potentially not as healthy as they'd like. And the other really important one, I think, is that cruelty to animals is linked to cruelty to children. And I've done a little bit of reading about this recently, and it is quite extraordinary the number of publications that there have been in recent years, and even some going right back for hundreds of years, around the link between cruelty to animals and cruelty to children. My experience in remote Australia is that if animals are unhealthy, it's much more likely that people will be cruel to them. Where you see people doing something cruel to an animal, throwing hot water over it or whatever, it's generally because the dog is diseased. Maybe it has a bleeding ulcerated tumour, which and people don't want it around, and so they become cruel to it. It's very much my view that if we can keep the dogs healthy, people then have great self-esteem about their dogs. They treat their dogs better, and as we see, if people are treating animals well, then there's less risk of cruelty to children. Just looking at this little quote here from a recent article. Children who witness or experience animal cruelty or neglect are more likely in the future to engage in the abuse of other animals or of people, often mimicking the behaviour of the perpetrator. So it's critically important that we take steps to keep animals healthy, obviously because animal welfare matters in its own right and the welfare of the animal matters in its own right, but also because that's more likely to promote good animal care and less cruelty. Other considerations, one, health, obviously is something which is, I don't need to explain to anybody in in our faculty, the notion that the health of animals, the health of the environment, the health of people is all interlinked. We know that dogs transmit disease to people, and particularly dogs in tropical situations carry a number of important internal parasites, roundworms, soil-borne helminths, strongyloides, hookworms, also Giardia, Cryptosporidium. In addition to that, some important external parasites, in particular Sarcoptes scabiei or scabies, and fleas. And as we'll see in the next slide, this becomes really important, particularly in the context of a very important disease in humans. And that disease is rheumatic heart disease. This latest strategy was released just in September last year with the view to eliminating rheumatic heart disease in Australia by 2031. The prevalence of rheumatic heart disease in Indigenous Australians is almost as high as anywhere in any country in the world. 89 per 100,000 Indigenous people contracted rheumatic heart disease in a 5-year period between 2014 and 2018. And of those, 95% of rheumatic heart disease diagnoses are in Indigenous people, and 60% of those are under the age of 25 years. The little girl who I showed you in the pictures earlier sadly is no longer with us. She passed away 3 years ago as a consequence of rheumatic heart disease after 5 lots of open heart surgery and 15 years of living with the challenge of rheumatic heart disease. She died of an entirely preventable disease. She was born a completely normal, healthy kid. She died of an entirely preventable disease in a country which I would argue has potentially the best health system in the world, and yet we couldn't keep her alive. So there's a big job to be done, and it goes then to the causes of rheumatic heart disease. Rheumatic heart disease is an autoimmune disease, which is a consequence of a strep A infection, a very common streptococcus, which can be acquired very often through a throat infection, through repeated throat infections, tonsillitis, but also through skin infections and skin sores. And certainly in my experience, skin sores are almost normalised in some of the communities to which we go. We see children who just live with lesions that would have us running to the doctor for treatment. These skin sores could be caused by sandfly bites. There's tropical environment, there's sandfly bites, there's fleas from the dogs, and there's also scabies. And in many communities, scabies is endemic. This obviously this picture I'm showing you now is actually a screen grab from the Rheumatic Heart Disease Australia website. And these are part of education programs to make people aware of the causation of rheumatic heart disease and then how to prevent it. And this is done often through what's called the healthy skin story, which is around how we prevent scabies, how we treat scabies with scabies creams, how we clean up the environment, the fomites, of course, that are spreading, the scabies being spread through bedding and so on. But also, and what is often not really, I guess, profiled as much in the medical world, is the role of dogs as transmitters, as potential transmitters of scabies. This is quite contested, and there'll be others within the faculty who can speak to this probably much more lucidly than I can. But the scabies, where scabies is endemic in communities, it's actually quite difficult to establish the source of the scabies. Did it come from another human, or was it transmitted from the dog? And when you bear in mind that in many households, there may be up to 20 or more people residing in the one house. Mattresses are being shared by large numbers of people. They're also being shared by dogs. So the capacity for transfer of scabies from dogs to humans or potentially even the other way, is very, very real. Any of you who have had the misfortune to contract scabies from a dog, and I did some years ago, will know that it is intensely pruritic. In other words, it causes an intense itch. And of course, that itch sets up scratching, which then causes a break in the skin, leads to secondary infection, potentially a strep infection, persistent skin sores, of course, which are then the source of scabies. So all of that, I guess, is the background to why we established the West Arnhem Land Dog Health Program, which we set up, as Jo was saying earlier, in 2005. What we wanted to do was to make a measurable difference to the health and well-being of dogs of West Arnhem and therefore contribute to the well-being of their owners. We make just annual visits, and during those visits we have house-to-house consultation to every home in a community. We offer parasite control, and whilst we're there offering them oral antiparasitics, we talk to them about the health of their dogs. We offer them surgical desexing. We also offer general veterinary care, and over time we've conducted an annual audit of dog population size and health status, and we also take with us final year veterinary students, which has been terrific, as I'll explain in a little while, in terms of building the capacity of the programs that we run. And so I guess the key areas of our program, and I thank Cam Raw for this slide. This is one of Cam's slides. Engagement and partnership, cross-cultural training, student engagement, a very big part of what we do, and really importantly, sustainability of what we do year by year. And so, as I said, we work in it's pretty hot, fairly trying conditions, but we try to have what we would hope is best, high gold standard practice for where we are, for the location that we're in. And this is, you can see Cam here, plus some of our graduates working with students in a remote community, desexing. We also go house to house. We administer medication to dogs, and here I'm actually instructing a couple of the women as to how they can apply the antiparasitic themselves. And the same on this slide here. And so that's the background, I guess, to our program. And what I'm just going to talk about now is how this program has then grown over time. We started off in 2004 with that very first visit to Rona's country out in the stone country of Central Arnhem. Through that visit to Rona's country, we then had people in Mulgawar saying, can you go back into Gumbalanya and visit Yellow House up in Argaluk camp, because I'd like you to look after my dogs there as well. And so in 2005, we went back to Arnhem Land and started our program in Gumbalanya. Then in 2009, through word of mouth and through some Aboriginal friends out in the Daly River region, we began offering programs in Nunnambala, Nunmarianga, and a couple of small outstations out in the West Daly region. I'd also like to acknowledge Thierry Betts and Stuart Ryan from Veterinary Clinical Sciences, who in 2015 established a program at Lake Tyers in Gippsland. And again, this arose through word of mouth, through a former colleague of ours who had contact with the community, the Gunai-Kurnai community of Lake Tyers, who were keen to have some dog health programs. So Stuart and Thierry started in 2005 and have continued ever since. In 2016, a different sort of engagement started, which I'll talk about in a little bit on a later slide, with the East Arnhem Regional Council. And we actually developed a memorandum of understanding with East Arnhem Regional Council to assist their resident vet, one of the very few communities in the top end that actually has a resident veterinarian. And she was at that stage a University of Melbourne graduate. And so we established an MOU with East Arnhem Regional Council to assist Emma in the delivery of veterinary programs with student assistance into East Arnhem communities, in particular Ramingining, Milingimbi and Gallowinku. And then in 2018, Stuart and Thierry extended their range to the Yorta Yorta country of Shepparton and working with the Rumballara community in the Goulburn Valley. Just some images here is again an acknowledgement of the work that Stuart and Thierry do at Lake Tyers in Victoria, and recognising that I guess engagement and partnership comes in many forms. It can be formalised, as it has been with East Arnhem Regional Council with an MOU, or it might happen quite organically through relationship between individuals. The relationship with Rumballara started because the mother of a former staff member was cared for by Rumballara aged care, and so this organic relationship grew, which has now grown into a very trusting and mutual relationship and engagement. Some images here, you can see Jemima Amory-Gale here, who worked for several months in East Arnhem, and this was at the time when, through support of the faculty, we were able to have the East Arnhem residency program, which first supported Jemima and then Cam Raw to work in partnership with the East Arnhem Regional Council in the delivery of animal health programs into that region. Student engagement is a really important part of what we do. Since 2005, over 120 students have been involved in our program. And speaking for Stuart, Thierry and myself, I think it'd be fair to say that through our combined programs, we have more students in the Melbourne Veterinary School have access to immersion in an Indigenous community organisation than I would argue than anyone else in the university, any other school within the university. In the last year before COVID, we had, I think, a total of 28 students out of 120 of our final year students who spent one or more weeks in a remote or regional community using their professional skills to the benefit of that community. And the elements of this, I guess, are really important. Obviously, clinical and professional training is a big part of it, but the cultural element, as I'll explain in a later slide, is a really important part of it. And what we can also demonstrate is that engaged students will often go on to be engaged graduates and are more likely to continue in similar work if they've been exposed and had the opportunity to be involved in this sort of work early in their careers. The cross-cultural training is very significant. We have a selection process. There are always, unfortunately, that we can't take all students who want to come. We can only take, often we're going to quite small communities. We can't overwhelm them with large numbers of Ballender or whitefellas coming in. So we have selection process and we're identifying not the students who necessarily have the highest academic ability or the best surgical skills, but students who we feel have a genuine passion to understand another culture, who are sympathetic to and passionate about Aboriginal reconciliation, and will be good ambassadors for us and culturally appropriate in the times that they spend in community. We have pre-trip planning and pre-trip cultural training, and we've also set up a website, and in addition to that, there's on-ground cultural orientation and training. This is the website which Cam has set up for us for the West Arnhem trip, which provides just a whole lot of information for students, orientation into what they might expect and importantly, how they should behave. But students have really appreciated this website. We always try, whilst we work pretty hard when we're there. We're only there for short periods of time, so there's lots of work to do, but we generally manage to fit in some cultural trips for the students as well. This particular one, students were on Inyaluk Hill looking at some ancient rock art forms with one of the local guides. We also spend lots of time around the campfire, I guess, or the kitchen table, just talking about and explaining. We invite our Aboriginal friends to come and join us with the students for meals, and they talk with the students. And they talk, for example, about the sentient landscape, the sense that not only do we as human beings know the landscape, but that the landscape knows us. that we are a small part of a big landscape, which of course is very consistent with our One Health philosophy, isn't it? We are just one small part of a big landscape that really knows and understands us. These are children collecting the bush honey, the native honey in the stone country of central Arnhem Land, and here enjoying sucking on the honeycomb. Students are introduced to another worldview, and this comes in different ways and at different times. For me, this was one of those light bulb moments, I suppose you'd say. We were driving along with my adopted brother-in-law, Romeo, and we saw this very pretty flower and said to him, "Hey, Romeo, what's that flower?" There was a long pause, a pause during which I almost became embarrassed, thinking, does he not know? Have I offended him? What's gone wrong here? He didn't come out with the Linnaean taxonomic name for this flower. He didn't come out with the purple native hibiscus or whatever it might have been. After a long pause, he said, "You know that flower? She tell us when that crocodile, she lay her eggs." The whole concept of the sentient landscape, of the relationship of one being with another being in the landscape, for me became very real in that particular moment. And then there's the other story which we share now with our students. Again, a true story, not involving me this time, but involving the local copper in Gumbalanya, who saw a little kid at the end of the day, wound down the window as he's driving past. "Hey, Sammy, how's your day?" And Sammy said, "It was a good day, boss, good day. I went fishing, I caught some fish." "Oh, terrific," says the copper. "How big were they?" He said, "Oh, they were about this big," he said, demonstrating that they were maybe 20 centimetres in length. "Hey, Sammy, that fish is too small. You've got to throw him back, young man." "No," says Sammy, "they're big fish, copper. They were big fish. I promise, true, is a big fish." And this conversation went back and forward with the copper saying, "You got to throw those little fish back." And the little boy with his eyes brimming with tears saying, "But copper, he was a big fish. True, believe me." And he was a big fish. Why? Because Indigenous people measure the size of a fish by its girth, not by its length. The way things look depends on where you're looking from. And I think if there's one thing that I hope our students come home from their trips with us is the recognition that their worldview is only one worldview, and that things will look very different when you look at them from a different way. So finally, I just want to talk about, I guess, our program outcomes and impact. The students obviously enjoy coming, and I won't read these quotations out to you, but you can see that their feedback involves cultural, enhanced cultural understanding, insight into Indigenous culture, and ways of working, ways of listening, ways of being that are maybe different from what they had before they came. One of the things that's really important from our point of view is the concept of sustainability. And what we say to the local people is, same time, every year we'll be back. For Gumbalanya, that means bush holiday time, which is the dry season in the middle of the year. "We'll see you next bush holiday." Gamak, they say. Gamak, good. "We'll see you then. Bobo." Ongoing graduate engagement is a really important part of the sustainability of our program. Two people in this image here, Lucy Collins, currently undertaking a dairy residency with us at Werribee, Gemma Cartwright, a graduate. Both have been back on multiple occasions to work with us on programs. And these alumni, over time, more than 30 alumni have contributed, and that provides sustainability for our program into the future. Another of our graduates, Erica, working with Teresa when she was a final year student, showing her how to do a flank spay on a cat. The other reason that sustainability is important is that change takes time, and a sustained effort over time is required. There's a lot of talk around this sort of work about how you have to have multiple visits per year, and why one visit a year can't make a difference. I think this graph can show you, and I thank again Cam Raw, who crunched all the data from our annual audits when he was the One Health resident with us a couple of years ago, that over time, you can make a difference. And in fact, you can see here 2009, where the average number of dogs per house in dog-owning households was something around 5, with some houses having up to 12 dogs. And you can see that by 2017, with annual visits over time, the number of dogs per household has actually reduced to 2. And even those houses which are outliers have only about 6 dogs per house. This is a change that has happened over time. The other thing that's interesting is that if you, this graph, I guess, is the same data, but presenting it a different way. The proportion of the population that was desexed at the start of the visit, the blue dots here, and the proportion that's desexed at the end of the visit in the orange dots at the top. And you can see that it takes quite a while before these two lines come together. Once the two lines come together, it means you have less work to do when you go, which means that you can then extend your reach. And that's exactly what's happened. We now have Gumbalanya under control. So we now spend only a week in Gumbalanya, and we can spend a week in island communities of Croker Island and South Goulburn Island, because we've reached a situation where the population is largely under control, and we're really just sort of mopping up, I guess, with each visit. I guess what's important about this is, if you think of the average funding cycle, if you think of grant funding or government funding, you rarely get funding that goes for more than 3 years. Occasionally it might be 5 years, but you don't get funding that goes for 10 years. And you could see what would have happened if we'd stopped going after 3 years or even after 5 years. It takes time to see these change, and sustainability is a really important part of what we do. Just finally then, in the last 5 minutes, I just want to talk a little bit about One Health research. I started by saying I'm a teaching specialist, but obviously zoonosis and also anthroponosis is really important in Indigenous Australia, and there are opportunities for research, and we have collaborated in a number of ways. When Cam was in East Arnhem as the East Arnhem resident, he was working with colleagues from the Doherty, taking swabs from dogs and cats in the same or neighbouring households from where the Doherty folk had taken swabs from mothers and infants who had either skin sores or nose or mouth, or either skin sores or just taking nose or mouth swabs. We were looking to see whether we could identify antibiotic-resistant bacteria, or those that were responsible for severe infections, which can lead to rheumatic heart disease or kidney disease. So a really nice example of collaboration between the medical world and the veterinary world. Another collaboration was that I collected transmissible venereal tumours from dogs, which are not uncommon. Fortunately, they're much less common now in the communities that we go to, but were relatively common when we started. And these tumours were submitted to a group in Cambridge, led by an Australian, Liz Murchison, who was interested in the genetics of canine transmissible venereal tumour. And as a somewhat ironic twist of circumstance or something, I suppose, in the last 2 years, I've been incredibly fortunate and to be a co-author on publications in Nature and in Science on this particular, based on the data that Liz and Andrea and her colleagues have derived. And fundamentally what they've established, just as a point of interest, is that, I've got the reference here to this, but it seems through the genetic analysis they've done of the different haplotypes of tumours that they've collected from all over the world, that this particular tumour probably developed in one dog somewhere between 4,000 and 8,500 years before present. It then spread across Eurasia. Then, and this I think is quite fascinating, about 500 years ago, at the beginning of the maritime era, it then spread to the New World, to the United States, North America and South America, and then later spread back from South America to Africa and to other parts of the Far East. And then finally, the final lineage of this, more recently, involved spread then back from Russia, back ultimately to Australia, which is where our samples were collected from. So we're always interested in any sort of collaboration that any of you might have. If you're interested in any materials that we can collect, we're interested to help with that. Having said that, though, the primary role, I guess, of our work is to improve the health and well-being of the people and their animals of the communities that we visit. And I'd just like to finish, I guess, by saying what I believe are the keys to appropriate engagement. One of my Indigenous friends said to me recently, you know, if you want to build trust, Liz, you need tea, tucker, and time. And that's actually exactly what we're doing in this picture here with Isabel and her sister and her nieces and nephews, sitting having lunch with them at the end of a visit. There's a student with Jen Heffernan, just sharing time, sharing stories, and building trust. I guess if we put it into the 3 R's, I see the 3 R's of sustainable engagement with any community, and I don't think it matters whether it's an Indigenous or any other community, is relationship, reliability, and respect. Building genuine relationship, having the same people come back every time, not as one of our Indigenous friends in Manangrida said, you Ballanda mob, you're all the same, you're like seagulls, you fly into town, you flap about, you make a big noise and then you fly away again. We don't want to be like that. We want to sustain relationship, want it over time, and we do that by being reliable. Every year, same time, we'll be back. And finally, demonstrating deep respect for the people and the cultures of the people we seek to help. So that's it, thank you. Just want to acknowledge the Gulmingu people of West Arnhem, the Ulnu of East Arnhem, who've welcomed us to their country and taught us. I've given you the names there of the key veterinarians, all but one of whom are alum of Melbourne University, who help in leading our programs. And importantly, the Yulgaba Foundation, who have supported us with funds over the last 4 years, and also the wonderful Kate Gordon-Addison, who supports us through her will. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Liz, for that fascinating presentation. I'm sure we have lots of questions for you, and the participants can ask questions by typing them into the Q&A box, and then we should be able to unmute people to ask their own questions. But perhaps while people are doing that, Liz, there are so many things that we could ask questions about, and I guess one of the things that struck me in all your beautiful pictures are the diversity of those dogs. So they're all different colours and shapes. Do we know what origin these animals are? Do they have a dingo type origin? Do we have dingoes in these communities still? And is the relationship between perhaps dingoes and these other dogs any different, or you know, can you elaborate on that perhaps?
Thanks, Jo. I think there is most, and I don't know the genetics of it, but I think there's most definitely dingo genetics in many of the dogs. So and certainly if you go back to those sort of invader observations and so on, they definitely did adopt dingoes from the wild. I think they found domesticated dogs were easier to train probably, and so they then adopted those. There are some recent problems around introduction of the basic dog in Indigenous communities is what we call a camp dog, and they're a great little dog. You know, they're sort of 12, 15 kilos, probably got a bit of sort of kelpie type of dog in them, but they're a great little dog, good conformation, short coat and so on. Aboriginal people, just like us, they love to get hold of different sorts of dogs. Goombulanya has had a bit of a problem recently because, can you believe it, people took Shar-Peis into the community. I mean, a dog less suited to tropical life, you can't imagine. So there's a bit of Shar-Pei there in Owenpelly. They love little dogs, chihuahuas. They'll often go into a pet shop in Darwin and buy little chihuahuas and bring them home. The worst problem comes from many of the white fella contractors who go into communities who are sometimes, not always, but sometimes of the camp and shooting and fishing type variety of fella who take their big pig dogs with them. Most normally are not desexed because that might make their dog a bit less attractive to them. And then their dogs interbreed with the local dogs. They produce huge dogs which people can't afford to feed. They have huge litters. When they bite, they cause a lot more damage than a little dog. So there's a whole range of dogs now, and it's part of the colonisation, I guess, that all our weird and wonderful breeds of dogs have made their way into the communities as well.
Thank you, Liz. We have a question from Anna Shree. I think we can actually unmute Anna. Yes, we can. Anna, can you ask your question?
I just had a question relating to just the long-term employment of people in the communities. I used to work on Elco a little bit as a student, and when I first graduated, and there was a program with animal management workers. But I kind of wonder what your thoughts are about long-term employment for local people in this kind of work, given that when the programs are done, they're often only done a few times a year or once a year.
Yep, that's a really good question, Anna. Thank you for that. And yes, there's certainly employment for people in this sort of work, but it relies on councils being prepared to fund the positions for people to have the work. The other challenge, of course, is yes, it wouldn't necessarily be full-time work if they're doing animal health, anti-parasitic type work, because it only needs to be done every few months, I guess. What we really want is for Indigenous people to have improved educational opportunities, better educational outcomes, and for people like me to not have to go to communities like Gulawinku because there are local people, local veterinarians who can service the community's needs. That's the end goal, I guess, for our program to be redundant, because there are Indigenous veterinarians, Indigenous doctors running programs for themselves.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question from Maritzel, I think it is, about community animal health workers. We can unmute Maritzel.
Hi, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Very good presentation. I just have, I wonder if there are community animal health workers that they can conduct awareness in the community or other activities depending on the training that they have received when you are not there. And in addition to that, if in order to be more sustainable, they can conduct other activities, not necessarily in dogs, but in other animals that they might have.
Yes, that's right, and absolutely. And funnily enough, the organisation, some of you will be familiar with, Animal Management in Rural and Remote Indigenous Communities, or AMRIC, advocates very strongly for that, and some communities support that. Funnily enough, animal health actually comes under housing and infrastructure rather than under, it's generally not part of the clinic. The clinic in a community is not linked to the animal health program anyway. They're quite distinctly different. In some communities that certainly happens, and certainly through some employment schemes like CDEP in communities, Aboriginal people, where there is a willing supervisor, I guess, Aboriginal people will work in a sustained way to manage antiparasitic distribution and so on. What it really relies on is having supervisors in roles in local government who see the benefit of the program, who advocate to have the positions for people to do this, and are prepared to buy the consumables, the drugs, and so on to make the programs possible. And that varies from community to community. But part of what I think we need to be doing, I think our role is really to push the One Health message and to improve awareness of the importance of having healthy animals for a healthy community, so that the dogs are not regarded as a pest, something that needs to be dealt with. But in the past, ways of dealing with the dog problem, people would talk about semi-owned dogs. I hope I've made it clear from my talk, these dogs are anything but semi-owned. They know who their owners are, and their owners know who their dogs are. Certainly they're free roaming, but they're not semi-owned. But if the dogs are regarded as the dog problem, then authorities are prone to come in and to think that the best way to solve the dog problem is to cull the dogs and to reduce the population, which of course ends up replacing potentially desexed dogs with entire dogs, which are going to breed more. And that's not a sustainable solution at all. So I think our role as veterinarians is really to advocate for the animals, to advocate for the people, and to spread the message of One Health and the importance of having a healthy, sustainable population of dogs, and why it's important for local government to take on that responsibility. So, for example, in West Arnhem, where we go, the local council, which is largely overrun with white fellas, doesn't think that dog health or dog management is their responsibility. And whilst they have that view, they're not going to invest a scarce resource in paying people to run a dog health program. That's part of the dilemma, I guess.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And just with my eye on the time, we might have one last question. There's one last question on the list that I can see here, and it's perhaps related to what we've already been speaking about. But would Gayatri like to ask their question, please? If we can unmute Gayatri.
Thank you, Gerald. Thank you for the wonderful presentation.
Oh, I'm sorry, we can't quite hear you. Yeah.
Yes, I can see the question there. Thanks, Gayatri. I can see your question there, which is the group also doing any local training education program to Indigenous communities to look after the animal health? Yes, absolutely, we are. We visit preschools when we're there. We visit schools. We visit mothers groups. We actually give talks to the nurses. I mean, we in Gumbalanya, there's a particular worm called strongyloides, which causes it spread. It's a soil-borne helminth, which is spread from dogs through the soil to humans, and causes chronic ill health and potentially death in humans. It's prevalent in the top end. It's diagnosed with an antibody test. We were talking to the head nurse in Gumbalanya, and of course Cam's work is on, his PhD work is exactly on this particular helminth, and we said, well, it'd be terrific if we could potentially, sort of collaborate and look at whether the haplotypes of the strongyloides that we find in the dogs is the same as that in the humans. The response was, what would be the point? We just treat the people anyway. And so a lot of our work is actually around those conversations. Well, it does make a difference. You can keep treating the people, but unless you're treating the dogs and eliminating the source from the dogs, you're never going to overcome your problem. Similarly with the scabies, if we're not ever acknowledging that dogs have Sarcoptes scabiei as well, then we're not going to eliminate scabies from the population just by washing, bedding and treating the humans. We need to be treating the people as well. So yes, we do work with in all the communities we go to. We work with the health service. We work with the school if they're at school when we're there, and importantly, AMRIC, who are overarching advocacy group, not-for-profit organisation, they're doing that sort of work all the time as well.
Thank you, Liz. And just with my eye on the time, we will have to finish there. But thank you so much for your presentation today. I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure everybody else did as well. So thank you to everyone who joined us today. I hope you'll be able to join us again on April the 13th when we have our next speaker, and that's Professor Paul Taylor speaking on protecting Australia's borders from inclusion of exotic plant pathogens. But thank you again. Thank you, Liz, and thank you everyone who came today.
Thanks, Jo, and thanks, John, for the opportunity to speak, and thank you all for coming and listening.